And hello, everyone on Zoom as well. Hello. So this is very exciting. The stuff that I've prepared for today is just like these songs have been like bang, 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 bang. Yes, tick, 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 tick. So it's it's lovely when the Holy Spirit just kind of confirms stuff for you. So it's very exciting. So today we're carrying on in Acts, and the other week Paul Rayner was speaking on Acts chapter 19. And in that chapter, Paul and the believers were in Ephesus. And after a local metalworker, he earned his living from making shrines and idols. He stirred up trouble against the believers. There was a riot. But thankfully, the town clerk, or mayor that he's called in some translations, was able to quieten down the mob, and the disciples who had been seized were unharmed. So then we come to today's passage, which is Acts chapter 20, verses 1 to 12. And I'm going to read it from the English Standard Version. And I apologize for some of the pronunciation. It's probably going to be a bit Welsh. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus of Berea, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. So this passage, it's in 2 parts, really. The first 6 verses are a bit like a travel diary, and it's outlining Paul and company's movements after the riot in Ephesus. And now, I don't know about you, but I can kind of find it quite hard to keep all the geography straight in my head when I'm reading Acts. I was never very good at geography anyway. And it can just be hard to have it clearly mapped out, even when I've looked at the maps, which I do when I'm preparing. So why does Luke spend so long outlining Paul and the early believers' movements and journeys? Well, I found reading Tom Wright's commentary on Acts about this passage really, really helpful. As he explained that some of the greatest stories ever told are centered on journeys, great journeys. He mentions 2 of the great epics of the ancient world. There was Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. And actually, Virgil's work was written probably only about 1 or 2 generations before Paul was around, so people were aware of this. And then there's stories like The Lord of the Rings more recently, which was and is hugely popular. And, you know, we know that lots of people love to travel. One of the things that people have talked about a lot, Joe, over coronavirus is missing being able to travel abroad. But actually, stories about epic journeys, they're about more than just physical journeys. So Tom Wright explains, he says this: "We feel the power and the pull of a story which enables us to reflect at a deep structural level on the journey through time which we are all making. The journey of our lives has many twists and turns. We carry memories of, as we say, where we've been, in the sense of what has happened to us. We carry hopes and fears for where we might go next, in the sense of what may yet happen to us. Even if we live in the same street or the same house, all our life long, we are on a journey, whether we like it or not. And we greatly value stories that help us to see things like that. I think this could have been written straight for me. I was like, oh yeah, that's me, that's me. I love stories like this. And you only have to think about stories like the Pilgrim's Progress and those passages in the Bible, like running the race to reach the goal, to see that our life of faith is often compared with a journey. And for me, this sense of progress and purpose in life is key. The adventure of life with God hasn't got that much to do with geographical journeys for me, although that has played a part in the past. But there is definitely this sense of growth and moving towards a goal. And I think that this Christian view of life is really distinctive in our current culture. You know, youth is often seen as of ultimate importance, and people try to reclaim it their whole life. Age can be seen as something negative. But for us, the best is yet to come. The end will be better than the beginning. And each day, whether good or bad, brings us closer to our goal. And this is such a blessed and freeing way of living. Let's not be fooled into following the world's cult of youth or wasting today because we think we've already had our glory days. Every day is precious because the Lord made it and he's given it to us as a gift. All we have to do is decide what we're going to do with it. So for the most part in this passage, Luke doesn't go into great detail about where Paul visits. But again, we see he's visiting the churches that he helped to establish or that he has visited in the past, and he's encouraging the believers there. And it's interesting how often we see that Paul and the other early church leaders do this. They go and visit existing churches to encourage them. And of course, in certain churches that are more structured, like the Anglican Church, this still happens. You have archdeacons and bishops and archbishops, and they sometimes travel around and meet with the churches. And this might not be so clearly seen in less structured churches, but I think we've all known the blessing of having believers that we respect come into our churches and our homes to encourage us and help us to continue to learn. The Bible calls us to submit to one another and to submit to the authority of our leaders. It's really important that we never think that we can know it all, because we never will. But if we have humble hearts, we can learn from anyone, and especially from those who are more mature in the faith. And I just think it's really important that we remain open to instruction and take the opportunities we get to be refreshed by our brothers and sisters in our Christian community, but outside of that too. Because there is only one church, one family. So it just makes sense that we take advantage of the wealth of wisdom that this worldwide church contains. But what Luke does describe in detail in this passage is Paul's travel companions. There are 7 of them, and they're named, and it tells us where they're from. And they represent different churches which Paul had been involved in the past. And you might remember some of these as we've been going through Acts, some of these cities that are mentioned, like Berea, which was the one where when Paul went there, they read their scriptures every day to check out what he was saying. And a lot of these believers who are mentioned here, these 7, they also crop up in other parts of Acts. They are part of the community of believers, or they're mentioned at the end of letters, of some of Paul's letters. And I think that all these believers mentioned here from all different places remind us again of this global nature of the church family, and the way in which Jesus' great commission to preach the good news in Judea, Samaria, and to the very ends of the earth was already being fulfilled so effectively. So why was Paul accompanied by all these believers, and why was it important that they were mentioned? Well, it seems that while Paul was traveling around and encouraging the churches, he was also collecting money for the Christians in Judea who were struggling. And it seems like these companions, these traveling companions, they served two purposes of adding security, because they were carrying this money, but also as delegates from the many different churches to accompany the offering and act as an assurance that there hadn't been any dishonest handling of the funds. And I think this ties in again with this idea of submitting to each other. I think it's really commendable that Paul welcomes being held to account by his fellow believers. He's really open. Sometimes when people seem to have made it in their career or in their social circles, or sadly even in the church, they can be put on a pedestal and it can be seen as beneath them to be held to account by others, especially those who don't seem to have the same status as them. And this is such a massive mistake. And many have fallen prey to their own egos when they've gone down this route. What the Bible presents us with are examples of church leaders who were humble enough to accept scrutiny, who went out of their way not to offend others, and who accepted when they were wrong and changed their behavior accordingly. And this is our template. And it's very different from the pattern of leadership in this world. So that's the first half of the passage. It's a wide angle view of Paul and his companions coming, their comings and goings. And now we come to the second half, which is much more personal and detailed. You know, these next 6 verses focus on one day or night spent with one community of believers in Troas. And it seems, it mentions elsewhere that Paul intended to travel quickly to Judea and then on to Rome, but now he and his companions spend a week in Troas. And my study Bible suggests that this could have been because they were partly waiting for the next boat to travel on, but it's more likely because they wanted to spend time with this community of believers. And it looks like Paul waited for the Sunday service to leave. So it seems he wanted to be there for this believers' meeting, and it centered around the breaking of the bread. Now, this is the first reference in the Bible to a Sunday service, and I just think it's lovely how relatable it is, you know, that they met just like we meet now. And as well as being really detailed and intimate, like in this passage, it even mentions that there are lots of lamps in the room. That's pretty detailed. This passage is also a bit of a funny one. And I think, again, it's relatable for many of us, because who can say that they haven't seen someone fall asleep in a sermon, or in fact been that person who falls asleep in the sermon from time to time? I think if he isn't already, then Eutychus should be made the patron saint of sermon snoozers. And I think for me, this is just another one of those passages in the Bible where you think they couldn't have made that up. Why would they include that in the Bible if it wasn't true? Because it's not very complimentary to Paul. It says that even after Eutychus died and was raised back to life again, he carries on talking until daybreak. And the idea that someone would fall asleep in the middle of a religious leader's teaching, I feel like that would normally be left out of the history books. So I think this just goes to show how true the Bible is. But honestly, I think that this story is so lovely. It tells us a lot, because you've got Paul there and he's so earnest and passionate. He could talk about Jesus all night, and he actually does talk about Jesus all night. But the room is full of lamps, and that probably made it stuffy. That's why it's mentioned. It probably made it a bit stuffy. So there's this young man. People didn't used to have Sundays off. So this young man might have been working all day. He's a bit tired, a bit stuffy. Maybe he sits by the window to get a bit of fresh air to wake himself up a bit, but he can't help it. He falls asleep anyway. And then he falls to his death. And of course, this would have been a massive tragedy if that had been how it ended. But Paul gets up and he goes down, he throws himself on this young man, and the man revives. And the passage ends by saying that the believers were greatly comforted or relieved. And I just love to imagine being there. Like, can you imagine what Paul thought of someone falling asleep and dying in the middle of his talk? And how did Eutychus feel when he was revived? Sorry, I can't imagine what it was like. But I think that this passage reveals a really lovely truth, that there is a place for passionate preaching and earnest, long discussions well into the night. But there's also grace for falling asleep in a sermon. This faith is for everyone, and grace is for everyone. Sometimes we really like to define things and say what's right and what's not, or what's good and what's not. And I've heard both sides of this. I've heard people say that sermons shouldn't be longer than 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, because people who are listening will get bored. But then I've heard the other side of the spectrum, where people say that believers and even children should be able to sit there in perfect concentration for however long that preacher decides to preach. And I think that this passage just goes to show that there's a lot more grace than that in both directions. The Spirit works in mysterious ways through really imperfect people. So all in all, this passage, it covers a lot of ground, literally and figuratively. We hear even more about Paul's missionary travels, and we meet representatives from many different churches. But we also get into the detail of one community Sunday service. And I think it just reflects how vast and amazing God's plans are, but also how intimate and comforting they are. And funny too. After all, it is the joy of the Lord that is our strength. So I'm just going to finish read a blessing to you, and then I'm going to finish with a prayer. This is just from Romans 15, verse 30. And it just, this idea that joy is part of our lives. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Lord, I thank you for your word, and I thank you for the privilege of being able to speak on it. Thank you that we all get to have Bibles. And I thank you for just how much you've got to say to us. You're speaking to us all day, every day. And thank you that we get to listen and get glimpses. And there's so much wealth in what you want to share with us. I just, I pray that we would know that grace in our lives, not compare ourselves to others, not think we've got to define how things are, but just to know what it is to walk hand in hand with you, and just to be sensitive to your moving, and to be refreshed and just completely at ease in who you have made us to be and the walk that you want us to go on. Lord, thank you that we've got the whole of heaven to tap into. Thank you that we're already seated in the heavenlies with you. And I just pray we'd walk out that power in this life, and that others would see it. Thank you that we are not on our own, and we're not doing this under our own steam,